Welcome in. It is the North Side Baseball Podcast. He is Brandon Glick. I am Mitch Widmeyer, talking anything and everything Chicago Cubs baseball. Brandon, appreciate you taking the time today. I don't remember the last time I recorded a podcast episode on North Side where the Cubs weren't in first place, but we are recording this on a Tuesday for a Wednesday publish before the game. Game 2 against Kansas City has taken place. I guess we'll start there before we roll through the topics. Again, if you're watching via our YouTube channel or Northside Baseball, you can see the topics on the right of your screen. If not, it'll be a little more of a surprise, but that's never a bad thing. Where are you at with the Cubs now as we enter this Tuesday, and they are now a game behind the Milwaukee Brewers, who have won 11 in a row. And might I add, to the Brewers' credit, very impressive 11 wins in a row, because it started before the All-Star break, and when you get the break, it can kind of, reset your momentum, and they just carried it right into a West Coast trip, sweeping the Dodgers in LA and taking game 1 on Monday night against Seattle. So how are you feeling about the Cubbies now that they're in second place?
Yeah, it's great to be here, by the way. Thanks for having me. I'm still very optimistic about this team. Like you said, credit to the Brewers. We just saw it with the Red Sox. The Cubs obviously just took 2 of 3 from them, and the Red Sox were rolling into that series on a 10-game break going into the All-Star break, or 10-game winning streak. So it's one of those things where, credit to the Brewers. Obviously, they've been doing this for a while now, just putting together these rosters that don't look super star-studded, but finding a way to win. They're 20 games above 500 at this time of recording, and so it's just amazing. But I'm still very optimistic about the Cubs. It's hard for me not to think that this is probably going to be their best chance to do some damage in the postseason for maybe a little bit. Obviously, Kyle Tucker's contract status remains a big storyline with this season. But overall, the Cubs have beaten really good teams this year. They've obviously taken advantage of some weaker parts of the schedule. They have a pretty favorable schedule going into August and September. So, yeah, it's tough to see them lose, their share of first place for the first time since like earlier mid-April. But I'm still plenty confident that this team's going to make some noise.
I'm right there with you. The Brewers, and I label myself as someone who's a huge baseball fan, obviously a Cubs fan, but I watch a ton of different games, and I covered the Brewers for 3 years at my previous job. But the Brewers have this knack for, like, when I watched them even this year, and it's not a slight to these guys, but they have certain players where it's like, who is Caleb Durbin? Like Isaac Collins. Like, I never heard of these guys. And then you look at their numbers, and they're going through these stretches where they're like really stepping up. And, like Andrew Vaughn was like a nobody for the White Sox. And then he comes over to the Brewers down in Nashville at AAA, gets the call up, and the Brewers haven't lost since they've called him up. They just have a knack for that. I even think Pat Murphy had said the other day that, we have a bunch of guys that nobody knows about, but we find a way. And that Milwaukee, we'll get to it down the road in this podcast today, talking about that NL Central race. But to me, they are the boogeyman right now for the Chicago Cubs, and they have been the last couple of years. But the Cubs have a lot of good things going their way. They'll see, of course, when people listen to this, the game will have concluded, but seeing Rich Hill starting on Tuesday night for Kansas City, I was like, holy crap, Rich Hill's still doing it at 44, 45 years old, something like that. And he'll face a lineup that, if I had to guess, again, the game will have concluded by the time this comes out, but I'm guessing, because Rich Hill's a lefty, that we'll see Nico Horner at the top of the lineup instead of Michael Busch. And I kind of wanted to get your thoughts as we get into the swing of things here, Brandon, your thoughts about the lineup change by Craig Counsell. Nico, pretty much when lefties are on the mound leading off, Michael Busch when it's a righty, Ian Happ slides down more towards that 6th spot in the order. I like the move. Nico Horner, to me, Brandon, he's more of a leadoff hitter that we would have seen like 10 or 15 years ago. Maybe not that far back, but somewhere around that range. He's in the 99th percentile in strikeout percentage, 98th in whiff percentage. He doesn't strike out. There's not a lot of swing and miss, tons of contact. But he doesn't hit for power, right? He's 8th percentile in hard hit percentage, 13th percentile in exit velocity. But he makes contact, and I think those were kind of like the treasured leadoff hitters around like a decade ago. But then you have Michael Busch that you can offer when there's a righty on the mound, and it's kind of like a complete 180 to what you see with Nico Horner, whereas with Michael Busch, brings power, slugging, barrels the ball up. Like, he's a threat to lead off a game, and with one swing, it can be 1-0. Cubs are in front. And so I like the move by Craig Counsell. I wish we would see Michael Bush, maybe not at the top of the order, but against lefties more consistently at this point. I know the numbers and the metrics aren't necessarily, shining, uh, but I'm at a point where is it adamantly better with Justin Turner instead of Michael Bush? And to me, it's just not. So Ian Happ sputtering, to me, the move made sense. What have you made of Nico Horner and Michael Bush kind of splitting duties at the top of the lineup?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, because obviously Ian Happ's sort of been like that prototypical modern-ish leadoff hitter in recent. He sees a ton of pitches per plate appearance. He's got a little bit of power. He obviously bats from both sides of the plate, so it's you're never really in a disadvantage in terms of the handedness. But obviously, with him struggling really badly the last 30 days or so, there needed to be a change. I think Michael Bush is actually my preferred leadoff hitter. He's very much in the same vein in the way that Kyle Schwarber, has been deployed by the Phillies in recent years. Last year I think Schwarber set like the MLB record for leadoff home runs. Obviously, Bush doesn't have that kind of power, but it's very much a similar kind of at bat where it's a guy who's really patient at the plate. He's not going to chase. Something Happ is good at as well, but it's someone who can do damage, and set the 2, 3, 4 spots in the order up really quickly. Whereas Nico Horner, like you mentioned, is definitely more of that old archetype of, get on base, steal a base good base runner, high contact hitter who's not going to hit a leadoff home run most of the time. So it's a different dynamic when you don't have that consistent, when Ian Happ's not the guy every single day, day in and day out, serving as leadoff hitter, who's going to draw, these plate appearances that might take 5, 6, 7+ pitches. It's different because Michael Bush, when it's against a righty, obviously the lineup's going to tend to look like Bush, Tucker, and then probably Suzuki at 3. And then obviously when it's Nico, it's righty, lefty, righty. So it's a different look for the Cubs to offer up to opposing teams. I think that Craig Counsell's doing a good job with, obviously the players on the roster, given the circumstances of Happ needing to be moved down in the order as he works through his struggles. But yeah, I mean, I think that, like you mentioned with Justin Turner, I think, I've been a big advocate on Northside Baseball and some of the other Cubs sites that I work on that, I think Turner's just really needs to be relegated to full-time bench duty at this point. I know that
Vibes guy.
Yeah, he's a vibes guy. He's a leader. He's well liked in the clubhouse. He's been around the sport for a long, long time at this point. He's got championship DNA, I guess, as it were. But it's definitely one of those things where he's just not the player he used to be. And as a bench hitter, as a pinch hitter, he can be valuable. But Michael Bush is, he's hot right now. He needs to be playing first base every day. And if that means putting him leadoff even against lefties, and then maybe putting Suzuki at 2 and Tucker at 3, or whatever the variations may look like, I think that that needs to sort of become a consistent presence in the lineup.
Where are you, or where do you stand as a lineup construction guy? Because typically, I will say I kind of fall into the camp of like, if you're not doing something radical like Kyle Tucker batting 8th or 9th, or a PCA or Suzuki down there, like I'm fine with almost anything you do. But there are exceptions to the rule. I know like a lot of the fans were really ticked off earlier in the season, or really it kind of carried into the All-Star break when like Dansby Swanson was batting 4th and 5th, and he had those really bizarre splits with runners in scoring position, and he slid down a little bit. And with Ian Happ, like had they kept him at the top of the order, I probably would have been okay with it if it was still going on. But when they made the move, I was like, yeah, it kind of felt like a change needed to be made. Where are you a big lineup construction guy, or how do you sit on that?
Yeah, I think it's something I like to look at when players are struggling, or if there needs to be changes made, is sort of how they produce depending on the spot they're in the lineup. Because some guys are really good at leading off innings, and they just have the right mentality to attack the first pitch. Or some guys are really good with when guys are on base and the pitchers are that they're having to juggle a lot of things. Obviously, as you mentioned, Dansby Swanson had some of those weird splits with runners in scoring position. I think it's, I'm not someone that is meticulously combing through every lineup. Again, that's Craig Counsell's job. That's not my burden to carry. But it's one of those things where, I've really come around in recent years on, I used to be sort of the opinion that, traditional, your best hitter should bat 3rd, your best power hitter should bat 4th. You maybe put, your RBI guy or whatever at 5th. That was sort of the Joe Torre back for the Yankees in the early 2000s. That was his philosophy. But now with the way the Cubs have been doing it with a lot of teams, where you put your best hitter at second, so he gets up more often. You put a consistent power guy who hits for contact and power at third. It changes the dynamic of the order a little bit. But I think the most important thing you can do for a player is putting them in the same spot consistently. I think there's been some calls for someone like PCA to be the leadoff hitter, because he's such a great power speed threat, similar to Shohei Ohtani. He's obviously not Shohei Ohtani, but it's in that same sort of vein. And it's one of those things where but he's thriving in that in the cleanup bowl. And so it's one of those things where are you making a change for the sake of making a change, or is a guy just comfortable? Is Pete Armstrong comfortable batting behind Tucker and Seiya Suzuki and just get used to that? having those guys work pitchers down, get on base, and thriving in those sorts of situations. So I don't think it's, the lineup construction stuff is necessarily the most important thing for a team. I think, defensive alignments, getting guys, playing consistently every day, getting them more reps and getting used to that 162 game grind is more important than anything. But as long as, Craig Counsell is, putting, the best guys, in the right position to succeed, then I don't think there needs to be too much change.
Well said. I agree with that. Monday's game against Kansas City, Cubs, jumped out to a lead, and then a terrible fifth inning. The train came off the tracks, and it wasn't just Ben Brown, but wanted to pick your brain, your thoughts about the young right-hander. I feel for the dude. Like, he's getting destroyed on social media, which, comes with the nature of social media, I guess. People can hide behind accounts. A lot of them don't even have real pictures or whatever. And I get you have to earn your keep. To me, though, Brandon, I keep going back to, if the Cubs had things go, according to plan or how they sort of mapped it out, I don't even think Ben Brown's in this spot right now. Justin Steele's out for the year. Has been out since April. Jameson Taillon on the shelf for an extended period of time. We're seeing them start Ryan Brazier as a bullpen game and then go to Ben Brown on Monday night. I would have to imagine that with kind of like the roller coaster ride he's been on this year, that if things had gone according to how the Cubs had hoped, Ben Brown's probably not even in that spot on Monday night. I wouldn't imagine. I don't know that for certain. Obviously, we'll never know that answer. And I get he wasn't good on Monday night. That fifth inning to me was far from just a Ben Brown issue. The Royals went. I had it in front of me. Here it is. The Royals went infield single, fielder's choice, single, double, infield single, error, wild pitch, pop out, ground out. Like, there was some bizarre, the Cubs just throwing the ball around every which way, and then the wild pitch led to another run. The part that keeps me optimistic is, you look at Ben Brown's StatCast page, he's still striking dudes out, limiting the walks, getting enough swing and miss. He's given up some really loud contact, and he's doing that far too often. I feel like with him, things can avalanche pretty quickly. Like, if one or two things go slightly wrong, it can lead to just a huge blow-up inning. Again, kind of like what we saw in the fifth inning, although, again, I'm not putting that all on Ben Brown's plate. End of the day, to me, with him, and then I'm very curious to hear your thoughts. I look at it, and I try to zoom out the microscope, and I'm like, the dude's 25, and he's working right now as a starting pitcher with a two-pitch mix, like 58% fastball, 38% curve. The changeup is a complete afterthought. He's using it right around 5% of the time. To me, if he wants to be a starter in the big leagues for the long run, I would imagine he has to develop a third pitch that isn't just a filler pitch, that he can use, that he can trust, and use it more than 5% of the time. So I know there's a big kind of like raining on the parade of Ben Brown right now on social media. I'm not in that group. I'm still somewhat optimistic when I take a look at his deeper numbers and then recognizing like it might be a stretch to think, but hopefully at some point he can develop a trustworthy third pitch too. I think that would help him immensely.
Yeah, it's a important debate for the Cubs, because obviously they got him for David Robertson a couple of years ago, and he was sort of viewed as behind Cade Horton. He was really sort of viewed for a little bit there as like the second big pitching prospect in the system. And, because he's got that big fastball. He's obviously got a a good knuckle curve. It hasn't looked quite as good this year as it has in past years, especially when he was kind of carving up the minor leagues. But it's definitely, it's one of those things where, having a third pitch, as you mentioned, is really important. His changeup is getting hammered again. He's allowing like a 625 slugging percentage on it this year. That's in a really small sample size, but
Yeah.
it's getting crushed. And I mean, the expected stats are a little bit better, but it's not a pitch right now that's effective. If you go on a Statcast page and you look at it, the movement profile of that changeup, I mean, it's all over the map. It's just there's some with a ton of rise, like a fastball. There's some that sink like a sinker. The velocity. It's not a pitch there's any real confidence in. And it's like you said, it's kind of like a filler pitch right now. And so it's an interesting question, because if this year, it's probably time for him to stop pitching in the rotation, despite the obvious needs. Hopefully with the trade deadline coming up in about a week, the Cubs will acquire, like another like number 2 starter, and then hopefully like a depth option or two. They obviously just signed like Spencer Turnbull, and so that's, I think, sort of the beginning of those kinds of depth moves. But I wouldn't hate to see him be moved to the bullpen. I was for a long time on team, keep him in the rotation, keep those guys who come up as starting pitchers as long as you can. I think we've reached that threshold with Ben Brown. He's got the fastball. His velocity is a little bit down this year, but he can dial that fastball up to the high 90s. His knuckle curve has been really good in short spurts. And maybe you could use him in like a Keegan Thompson style role from a couple of years ago, where he's sort of a fireman out of the bullpen, and he's pitching 2 or 3 innings and he goes through the order once. And then, and he can sort of cover some ground like that as like a high leverage long reliever, which is a role that, the Brewers have been using a lot the last couple of years. So obviously Craig Counsell sort of helped pioneer that. So it's a tough thing. I think that he's good enough to be on the major league roster. I don't think he's good enough to be in the major league rotation right now. I think I'm not a fan of the opener system where they have a guy get trotted out there for an inning, and then, you just send Ben Brown or whoever, or Jordan Wicks, to the Wolves and hope that, it delays, the lineup seeing him in extra time. And I think that just sort of messes with the guy's confidence, almost just having him trotted out of the bullpen then for, what effectively amounts to a start. So it's a tough situation. Obviously, that, as you mentioned, that 5th inning against the Royals wasn't ideal, but it wasn't like he was getting absolutely hammered. It's not like he was giving up home run after home run. So I don't think it's time to, to count Ben Brown out. I don't think it's time for, the Cubs to just stash him in AAA, as sort of one of those like quadruple A players who, just he's pure depth. And he's finished, as it were. I think it's time that, if the Cubs are going to hope to get any contributions out of him, obviously he's on the 40-man roster already, put him in the bullpen, see if he can handle that sort of short spurt sort of role, and dial up that fastball a little bit more, maybe ditch the changeup altogether, because that 2-pitch mix can work, obviously, in a short relief role. And if the results are good, maybe you keep him there long term.
Do you buy into that idea at all? Well, I think you said it. I don't want to put words in your mouth. I think you said like the Cubs' hand was kind of forced here. He strikes me as a guy that maybe could use like a hard reset right now, and he got a little bit of one right when he got sent down and then called back up. But I imagine that if the Cubs rotation was healthy right now, that Ben Brown probably wasn't going to get recalled for Monday night's game and serving as the guy who comes in after the opener. Do you believe in that too? Like I don't know. Just when I watch him, it seems like, the confidence isn't quite there. And when I see that with a young pitcher and he's fighting some of those demons, it almost strikes me as a guy like, man, he could use like a good long hard reset.
Yeah, I think it's.
But the Cubs might not have the luxury of doing that right now. That's the other part of this, right?
Yeah, it's fortunate that the trade deadline is coming up, because at most he's going to need one more turn through the rotation before hopefully reinforcements are going to arrive. I'm sure we'll get to it towards the end of this, but I'm sure the Cubs are going to be targeting some really high value pitchers. But I do think it's just. It's a confidence thing for sure, because again, the changeup is a relatively new pitch for him in his arsenal. Yeah, he's been working on it through the minor league. Even when he was with the Phillies, he tinkered with sort of like a split change for a bit. But he's it's one of those if you know that your fastball is not getting a guy out, and someone's sitting on a curveball and his only other pitch is a changeup that he can't locate or throw with any sort of consistent movement, it's a lost cause, that the entire at bat. So I'm not really sure if the Cubs can afford to right now give him that reset for the next couple weeks, because again, the pitching staff is just kind of decimated. Steele's out with for the season. Assad is on his rehab assignment finally, but he's going to be out for a while. Tyone's still out, and it's not and obviously they have Colin Ray and Cade Horton, who have been pitching okay, but they obviously haven't been like really really great this season. So it's just kind of a situation where, out of necessity, Ben Brown needs to try to find a way to work through it. But should reinforcements arrive, whether it's players getting healthy or trade deadline guys coming in, I think Ben Brown could really use just a little bit of time in AAA to just reset his arsenal and get back to pitching the way he should.
Last thing on Ben Brown, you think there's a chance that when the Cubs are wheeling and dealing here, as we all expect them to do at the trade deadline, that another team inquires about Ben Brown, like as part of a return package going to team A, B, or C?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think about a year or two ago, when Caleb Killian was sort of like the same sort of pitcher, big velocity starting pitcher, movement on his pitches, but he just wasn't figuring out the majors. That was a question that was asked a lot about, could the Cubs try to flip Caleb Killian while he still had some value and try to, get something back in a return package. Obviously now this year, they're for sure buyers rather than sort of towing that line. So I think it's possible. I wouldn't expect it. I don't think that, his value's sort of at its nadir right now. There's really just not a situation where Ben Brown is going to be like the centerpiece of any package. At most, he'd be sort of a flyer for another team to just take a chance on. It's certainly, I'd say that if he gets moved, it would be in sort of one of those like 40-man roster casualties where the Cubs are just bringing someone in, for prospects, and they have to get a guy out, and Ben Brown, too valuable to DFA. And so they ship him out in a separate deal. But I'd expect to see Ben Brown stick around for at least another offseason, because his arm talent is as good as almost anyone's in the system.
Northside Baseball Podcast. He is Brandon Glick. I'm Mitch Woodmeyer. However you get your podcast, always appreciate you tuning in. Let's pivot to the other side. A guy who got a reset earlier in the year. Started with the majors, down to AAA, back up with the majors. Matt Shaw, and I'm wondering if you think this might be just a little blip on the radar, or if he could be figuring it out. He started the month of July 1 for 27.
Yeah.
Post All-Star break, 6 for 11. A couple of bombs, had that big 3-run homer early on in the game on Monday night. I saw someone do a breakdown on Twitter, and I'm kicking myself because I'm not giving credit to who it was because I didn't write it down. But someone did a breakdown, like a quick 50-second video of like all the little tweaks he's made at the plate throughout the season. And since the All-Star break, he's back to doing sort of like a slight little toe tap, and you just hope it works. I'm curious what you think of Matt Shaw's sort of resurgence here post All-Star break at the plate.
Yeah, it's an interesting situation, because I've always been a little bit lower on him than most other people are in Cubs fandom, and especially in the writing communities, at Northside Baseball, Cubby's Crib, and places like that. I think that his swing is just not super tailored for major league success. Obviously, he had that huge leg kick that he's now he's worked down a little bit, thankfully, because obviously that just wasn't going to work against major league pitchers who can really manipulate a batter's timing. But yeah, I mean, it's the last few games have been really encouraging. He's got a couple home runs in his last 3 games. He's got I think 6 hits over his last 4 games. He's on a 4-game hitting streak. So it's positive to see. It's with these young guys. These mini streaks can be really big. Sort of just back or bouncing. I forget it, diving boards, whatever.
Yeah.
For them to sort of launch pad off of. And if it's a confidence boost for him, that's great. I think we've had a couple breakdowns, in written form on Northside Baseball about Shaw's mechanics, about, the changes he's been making, about, the way he's been, his approach has changed with attacking first pitches more often and trying to lay off stuff away a little bit more. It's a development curve. He's got, positive, whiff rates, his strikeout rates, pretty solid, especially for a rookie. He's just obviously not hitting the ball with a ton of authority right now. I think his exit velocity is in like the first percentile in all of baseball right now, which obviously is just not a pathway to success, and also not indicative of the prospect he's been coming up, because, he's always been consistently a guy who hits the ball hard. So I'm not ready to declare that this like little mini streak that he's on post All-Star break as like this big coming out party, as though, the third base problem is solved. The Cubs don't need to worry about it at the trade deadline. But I will say, he's turned himself into a much better defender than I thought he'd be. He's really, the last couple months, has been a really solid defender at third base, which is really nice to see. Following those like Christopher Morel years, where it was just sort of a gamble of what was going to happen. And he's been a great, he's a really good base runner. He's really impressed me in that aspect of his game. So I'd love to see him. It's one of those things where if this was 2-3 years ago, where the Cubs like weren't like ready to compete for the pennant, I'd love to see him get full playing time at third base. Like let him get full run. Obviously, this year circumstances are a little different. Third base has sort of been a black hole offensively for the team this year, whether it's been Shaw or John Birdie or Bruhan or whoever it's been manning the position, Gage Workman earlier in the year. So I I definitely would love to see the Cubs go after a third baseman and maybe push Matt Shaw into more of like a part-time role, maybe give him some opportunity to play around the diamond a little bit. But this little mini hot streak has been nice to see.
You kind of fed into my next point a little bit, and that is I still am of the belief that, even if the Cubs look at what this post All-Star break, this little stretch has been for Matt Shaw, and they're like, hey, we actually think he might be turning a corner, I don't think it should deter them from making a move at third base at the deadline if that's kind of the like if they're inclined to do so, if that's the route they want to take. And I know he's arguably the biggest bat that could be on the market. The fit for Eugenio Suarez to me would be more than perfect, and we'll talk trade targets in a little bit. But how it ties into Matt Shaw for me is that some of these other names like Ryan McMahon, Ke'Bryan Hayes, the Cubs love team control, right? You maybe don't want to trade for a rental, but if you are going to trade for a rental, to me it'd be Suarez, because you still believe in Matt Shaw. You think he can be, your pillar at third base for the future, but you get a guy like Suarez in on a rental, and then Shaw ends up just kind of being like a part-time or a bench guy the rest of this year. And then at the end of the year, Suarez goes elsewhere, likely, right, in free agency, and then boom, you plug Matt Shaw back in, compared to like, if they go third base, because you mentioned the phrase dark hole, and it has been that offensively this year. But if you go and you get a Ke'Bryan Hayes or Ryan McMahon, like how does that look next year or 2-3 years down the road when they're still under contract, but you still have Matt Shaw? So I don't think this stretch from him should have them thinking like, hey, maybe we don't need to address third base at the deadline. If I were the Cubs, I'd still, and I know, getting a number 2 starter is probably, and rightfully so, priority number 1, but I wouldn't take this recent stretch as something where they can now just, look away from potential third base targets. I'm assuming you're kind of in that boat too.
Yeah, I've been beating the Suarez drum for a couple months now. Really, really hard. I think he's such a good fit for what the Cubs need this year. He's just a power hitting right-handed guy. Him, Suzuki, Tucker, and PCA in the middle of the lineup is a really, really dangerous foursome to have. And so obviously, I'm sure we can dive into him more when we get to the trade target section. But I definitely think that Matt Shaw has not given us any reason to really think that he's the answer at third base right now. I think there's definitely, given the importance of this year with the way that this Cubs core is sort of structured, with Tucker being on his last year, and so some of these other prospects probably going to get moved at the trade deadline. I don't think you can give Shaw that sort of run time, like I mentioned, to really run away with the third base position and hope he figures it out. So again, and just on Shaw, it's, even as he gets hotter here, and as he looks to sort of turn things around, he's obviously had a sort of roller coaster year where he's had hot streaks, he's had cold streaks. Obviously, he had that reset in AAA, like you mentioned, but he's not hitting any pitch particularly well. If you go on his Fangraphs page or his Statcast page, the league average weighted on base average against most pitches is around like 315 for Shaw, whether it's fastball, breaking balls, or off speed pitches. They're all around like 270. It'd be one thing if he was really crushing fastballs and he needed to adjust to the slower stuff and change his plate approach. He's struggling against everything right now. So again, it's a case of a young guy being outmatched and outclassed by really, really talented professional athletes. I don't think this is the end for Matt Shaw. It could be a Ben Brown situation where maybe like Ben Brown, out of necessity, he needs to play third base right now. Hopefully the Cubs will get an answer at the trade deadline, and then he can spend the rest of the season, sort of rebuilding his confidence, making the necessary changes so that come next year he can, sort of reintroduce himself to the Cubs fans.
I think the domino effect too is, if you do trade for a Suarez or a third baseman for the rest of this year, Matt Shaw maybe goes back down to Iowa, but if he doesn't, Jason and I have hammered on this, as have most Cub fans, Brandon, for weeks now, months. Like, the bench is so bad. Like, Matt Shaw is your starting third baseman. It's like, man, he just, the consistency hasn't been there. But to me, it looks a hell of a lot better if it's like, man, Matt Shaw's on our bench now. Like, sweet. Like, maybe one day you DH Suarez because Suzuki's filling in left center or right for someone, and Shaw gets a look at third base. Then it's like, to me, the domino effect of having him potentially come off the bench, even though, if you're the Cubs, you're probably not crazy about him getting, limited reps, but it helps that out too, because the bench has been absolutely woeful.
I could not have said it better. That's absolutely, I think, part of the thinking here. Because, sure, for his long-term development, it's probably better for Matt Shaw to go down to AAA and get playing time every single day and rebuilding his confidence and changing whatever he needs to in his swing. But for the sake of this year, which, again, 2025 is a really important year for the Chicago Cubs, given how competitive they are, Matt Shaw on the bench doesn't transform the bench, but it makes the bench deeper, and it lets you sort of finally move on from Vidal Brujan, who's been a complete objective. All due respect to him, he's a top prospect for a while. He's been a disaster this year. He's been terrible for the Cubs ever since they got him from the Marlins. He just hasn't been. He's been a terrible bat. Craig Counsell has no confidence in him. The guy has had like 10 plate appearances in the last 2 or 3 months. So it's just one of those things where right now it's just it's a void of a roster spot. And if you can put Shaw in that position, and who knows, maybe giving him that sort of part-time duty where he can sort of watch a little bit more, soak in a little bit more from some guys. And when he does get to play, really hone in on those days when, he's in the lineup, maybe that'll help him, sort of, realign with what he's been trying to do as opposed to grinding it out every day. But I definitely think that would be a positive bonus to getting some third base help for sure.
I remember during spring training on Marquee, they were doing like an interview with Vidal Brujan. He was talking about how he was, soaking up the knowledge from Sammy Sosa and trying to get hitting tips from him. And I'm like, dang, all right, maybe we got something off the bench with Brujan. And oh my gosh, it is not gone that way this year at all. NL Central, we mentioned at the top, the Brewers entering play Tuesday. That's when we're recording this podcast for a Wednesday publish. The Brewers have overtaken the Cubs, a 1-game lead in the division. I'm going to quickly summarize both sides of the argument from my perspective through my prism, and then we'll get your thoughts, Brandon. The reason I am not worried, Milwaukee still has the 7th toughest remaining strength of schedule. Cubs have the 27th. You're not talking like 7 and 12th or, 4th and 9th. It's the Brewers have the 7th toughest schedule remaining. The Cubs have the 27th. I saw like 6 games with Pittsburgh, 6 with Washington, I think, or 6 with the Braves, who are, fluttering around, 3 still with the Pirates. And the Brewers still have, 3 with Toronto, 8 with the Cubs. And of course, the Cubs have to play the Brewers 8 times, but the Brewers have a much tougher schedule. So that tells me, like, when it's that big of a difference, that matters. That's going to factor in at some point. And then, like I said, the Cubs still get the Brewers 8 times. 5 of them are at Wrigley Field. So you're getting them on your home field for 5 of them. You would like to think the Cubs, maybe take 3 of 5. If we get greedy, want a bigger bite of the apple, you get 4 or 5. That'd be great. And then I know it sounds kind of arrogant to say, like, I do believe the Cubs are just flat out better than the Brewers. Like, I just think they are, and the Brewers are riding this wave, and they're a really good team too. But when I just break it down and I look on paper, I'm like, the Cubs are better than Milwaukee, right? Like, and I believe that the Cubs are way, way, way more likely to make a big splash trade at the deadline to help push them over the top than Milwaukee. Like, you're jockeying for a position in first place. Who could get over aggressive at this deadline? And to me, it's more likely that it would be the Cubs and the Brewers. Flip side of that, it's pretty simple. Here's why I would be worried. I think I said this at the beginning. Like, Milwaukee is the boogeyman. They have been. They do it with what appears to be lesser talent, names that, don't carry a lot of recognition throughout parts of the lineup. Like we all know Christian Yelich, we all know Jackson Chourio, we all know William Contreras, Freddie Peralta, Big Woo, Jacob Mizorowski now, but there's a lot of those names, like I said, Isaac Collins, Caleb Durbin. I remember a couple of years ago when I was covering them, and Blake Perkins was like playing everyday center field because Garrett Mitchell was hurt and out for the year, and I was like, like that name doesn't even ring a bell. And they just have guys like that, and it's not St. Louis, it's not Cincinnati, it's Milwaukee that is the thorn in the side for the Cubs and for this division, and they've shown that. So those are kind of my two balancing acts for why I would be worried and why I wouldn't be worried if I were the Cubs.
Yeah, it's frustrating because obviously Cubs fans, we've had to deal with the Cardinals sort of, their devil magic for forever, and now all of a sudden, the Cardinals are sort of kind of finally taking a mini step back, and now the Brewers are, just the new reincarnation of it, which is just incredibly frustrating. But I will say I agree with you in the sense that I think on paper the Cubs are just more talented than the Brewers. Like I don't think that's that controversial of a claim. Obviously, the Brewers have a better record at the time of this recording, but I think that just Kyle Tucker is obviously a really great player. Pete Armstrong is emerging as an MVP candidate this year. Despite the injuries, both Shota Imanaga and Matthew Boyd have really carried the rotation. The Cubs have a really good roster. And like you said, at the trade deadline, I do anticipate the Cubs to make much bigger buy-side moves than the Brewers. I think the Brewers, their sort of window for contention, as it were, I think is a little bit more long-term than the Cubs, right? The Cubs have sort of built this roster for the next 4 or 5 years, if that even, maybe it's even 2 or 3 years. But so I do anticipate the Cubs to really, be perhaps the most aggressive buyer at the trade deadline. But all that being said, when you look at the Brewers, it's not even like, they're being carried by like their few really great William Contreras is at, his weighted runs created plus is only 100. Jackson Churios is only at like 110. Those guys, might start to heat up in the second half of the season. And, and it's a testament to the Brewers that they've been winning even with those really big, their big name stars not performing like big name stars. And so it's, again, it's part of the organizational philosophy that they have of really great depth of, of having players that can play a multitude of positions and can play every day or can play once a week and still thrive. And obviously, as you mentioned, their pitching development team is as good as anyone in baseball. So I'm not really, prior to the trade deadline, I would say I'm still confident the Cubs will win this division, and hopefully following the trade deadline, I'll be even more confident on that matter. But it's amazing that the Brewers have, this quickly climbed back into it, that they're back in first place, and that the Cubs are sort of, on their back foot right now because of the Brewers' pressure.
I did find, and well said, I agree, Pat Murphy's quote from over the weekend. It's a little quirky, kind of takes a left turn, and I don't know how many times you've watched like a Pat Murphy press conference. It's very on par. He's a funny dude. But he was asked about this year's Brewers team, and Pat Murphy said over the weekend, and I quote, it's a bunch of guys that nobody's ever heard of. Like I said, no disrespect to the great fans of Japan baseball, but they can't name 5 players in our lineup. And yeah, they just, but they figure out a way. They constantly figure out a way. I think the Cubs have been, far more consistent this year than Milwaukee, which again, throughout the duration of a 162 game season, I do believe that matters. And then like we both talked about, the trade deadline will tell a lot. Like if Milwaukee were to go out and somehow, land a Eugenio Suarez or another bullpen arm, I kind of like how their rotation sets up for the playoffs for them, quite frankly. If you have a trio of Freddie Peralta, Big Woo, who dominated on Monday, and then Mizorowski, like that's pretty damn good.
Yeah.
But if they go out and they take a big swing and add a big bat, like then maybe my perception starts to change a little bit. But I think for two teams that could be neck and neck down the stretch as we kind of turn the calendar to August and into September, what happens at the deadline could carry a lot of weight for this division run. And I guess I'll follow up with, I have said for a couple of months now, even though they were hanging around, I didn't think St. Louis was built to stay in this thing for 162 games, but Jason and I both kind of agreed, like, we believe the Cubs will win the Central, but Milwaukee's not going to go anywhere. And now, of course, as we sit here on the 22nd of July, they have a 1-game lead on the Cubs. But are you under the impression it'll be Brewers, Cubs, till the final bell, or do you see Cincinnati or St. Louis sneaking into the picture?
I think that if either of those latter two teams are going to make a run, it'll be Cincinnati. Again, I've counted out the Cardinals far too many times and got burned for it. So
Yeah.
I'm just gonna I'll just assume that they find their way to win 100 games and win the division. But besides the Cardinals, I do think Cincinnati's got a good team. Again, they obviously have very frugal ownership, and that they tend not to be very aggressive. So they may have a very sort of plain trade deadline. They might play it really safe and just sort of run it out. In which case they'll probably be more wild card contenders than they are division contenders. But in terms of this Cubs Brewers race that's sort of been formulating the last month or so, I do think that Milwaukee is better positioned to handle their tougher schedule than the Cubs would be. Obviously, the Cubs have a much easier schedule, but that's mostly because obviously Milwaukee's pitching, like you mentioned, is just so deep, and that everyone that they're running out of the rotation right now is pitching quite well. I mean, they have old friend Jose Quintana, who
Yeah.
was never super great for the Cubs. He's pitching, better than he ever did for the Cubs right now for the Brewers at 36 years old. So again, it's a testament to what they do. But I will say it is sort of I think the fact that the Cubs and Brewers stop playing like in the middle of August, like that's when their final game is, benefits the Cubs more than it does the Brewers, because the Cubs have a much, much easier September than the Brewers do. And so any ground that needs to be made up much more heavily favors the Cubs. So if the Cubs over these next 8 games against the Brewers over the next month or so can take, 5 of 8 or can take, 6 of 8 or whatever the case is, that'll greatly benefit them in the long run. And it'll probably position them for for a division championship, because again, Milwaukee's not going to get a chance to play them head to head again and make up any ground that needs to be made up.
Let's finish up with Cubs trade targets. Jason and I have ran into the problem a couple of times where we're talking about a potential roster move, like someone getting called up or sent down. One of them was Ben Brown, when he got sent down, and from the time that we record to the time it gets published, a move has happened. So we could talk Cubs trade targets here on this Tuesday afternoon, and by the time this gets published Wednesday morning, maybe the Cubs have made a trade. But I'll defer to you to start, Brandon, and you can run with it whatever direction you want. Cubs trade targets, I say that to you, and where do you kind of turn your attention towards?
Yeah, this is a really interesting. Obviously, this time of year, smoke screens, rumor, people, especially on social media, is such a cesspool, especially this time of year.
Yeah.
Just because of people are desperately trying to get attention for being first or for being right about a rumor. I'm in different parts of the community. At Fansided at Cubby's Crib, here at Northside Baseball. I haven't heard anything that would be mind-bending news that no one else has heard. But I will say that I do think that Suarez should be. If I was running the Cubs, Suarez would be my first priority. I know the rotation is really important.
I love that take.
Yeah, I know that there is a need for another starting pitcher, especially if for whatever reason you're worried about like the health, or especially in Matt Boyd's case, who he hasn't pitched this many innings in years. If you're worried about durability, yes, another arm is needed. But I think Eugenio Suarez deepens the lineup so much for the Cubs. He can really transform the lineup. And again, the fact that he's a rental, and that which means that obviously he's going to be fiscally cheap, which the Ricketts will love, but also he'll be cheap in terms of prospects, which Jed Hoyer is going to love. So I just think he makes so much sense for this organization. I think that he might not be the best perfect fit for Wrigley Field, with his profile being very, very pull heavy, for at least in terms of power. And obviously, with the wind, especially in left field, can knock things down at Wrigley Field. But he's an adequate defensive third baseman. He's a great power hitting threat. And again, putting him, behind PCA and making that top of the lineup something like Bush, Suzuki, Tucker, PCA, and Suarez. I mean, that's almost no one, besides like the Dodgers, can compete with that kind of star power and the depth of that lineup. And so, again, it's just I really would love to see the Cubs make that kind of buy-side move. A couple of years ago, they made a very similar move for Jeimer Candelario, who Obviously then went to the Reds and then got released. But it was a very similar move at the time where he was a rental. He was probably the best rental bat on the market. And they made an aggressive move for him. Obviously, it didn't end up working out that season, but I really loved the move then. And I would really love this move now just because third base is really the one offensive position, especially with Miguel Amaya set to return at catcher, that is just it's been an issue for the Cubs this year. And so if you get an everyday third baseman, that just opens up so many other possibilities at the trade deadline.
With Suarez, to me, he's like we both recognize the clear need for like a guy that can be a number 2 starter in the rotation. Maybe you need 2 starting arms. I don't know. But to me, when you talk about like final piece of a puzzle for this offense, it would be Suarez.
100%.
Like last year, catcher was like that phrase you used earlier, dark hole. Like catcher was the dark hole offensively. They just they couldn't figure out how to solve that riddle. Send Yan Gomes out. Miguel Amaya kind of started figuring it out later on in the season. But for most of 2024, like catcher offensively for the Cubs was the dark hole. This year, that's been figured out with Carson Kelly, Amaya before he got hurt, and Reese McGuire out of nowhere since getting called up has been pretty good offensively. That one spot is just third base. And I know it sounds kind of crazy to say, but if you get, and I'm not saying a third baseman, if they specifically get a Eugenio Suarez with what he's done this year, I believe it takes what is already a pretty damn elite offense to another level, to another tier. Because you mentioned, like, if you can start your lineup with, Bush and Tucker, Suzuki, PCA, and then Suarez, that's crazy good. Think about the protection that would offer PCA having a guy like that behind him in the lineup. Like, it's crazy to think about. And the only reason I wouldn't do it, he's a rental, so it shouldn't, even though he's having an incredible year. I think he has like 5 home runs in the last 4 games or something like that, last 3 games, something crazy. But it shouldn't cost you the farm, right? Like, I guess if Arizona was like, well, we need Owen Case here, we need Moises Ballesteros, then I'd be like, man, I don't know if I want to give that up for even someone like Suarez because it's just a rental. But if it's not, your top prospect or something like that, I feel like you'd have to pull the trigger. Elsewhere outside of Suarez, where are you looking at for the Cubs if I wanted like specific names? I guess naturally we could probably pivot to pitching, to starting pitching.
Yeah. I'll give one last note on Suarez real quick.
Yeah.
When the Cubs got Candelario a couple years ago, again, another rental third baseman, that was a really, really small market for bats that year. So the price was probably pretty similar to what the prices for Suarez is going to be. That year, the Cubs gave up Kevin Made and DJ Herz, I believe, who at the time were like their 15th and 16th ranked prospects. That was a really deep Cubs system, probably a little bit better than what they have right now. But still, I think that if that's the sort of price that the Cubs can be looking at, where
no-brainer.
I think that has to be a no-brainer. Where if you're giving up a couple guys, just outside the top 10, again, this is the year. Like the Cubs are clearly – the Kyle Tucker trade, they gave up Cam Smith. They gave up Paredes, who's been having a great year in Houston. That move was made with this year in mind. I think you have to treat the trade deadline the same way. And so in that vein, my top starting pitcher for the Cubs is actually the guy they're going to face tomorrow, or when this is published today, Seth Lugo of the Royals.
Lugo, yes.
I really, really like him. I help manage Talk Sox, which is one of Northside Baseball's sister sites. I've written about Lugo a couple times over there as a fit for the Red Sox. I think it's the same exact thing with the Cubs. He gives you a ton of length. He's just a guy who knows how to pitch. I know it's like a really bad cliche. There's no analytics there, but he's just, he threw 200 innings last year. Ever since San Diego turned him into a starting pitcher back in 2023, he's been one of the best pitchers in baseball. I think he just fits what the Cubs do. And really importantly, he's a right-handed pitcher, which means that, in a playoff series, the Cubs don't have to run out, Imanaga and Boyd back-to-back if they don't want to. So I would love to see the Cubs make that move. Obviously, maybe the start tomorrow sort of serves as an audition for him with the Cubs, which would be pretty funny. But I really love what he could bring to Chicago this year.
Yeah, I actually just looked at Seth Lugo's StatCast page right out of the All-Star break, and it like nothing stands out. But the dude just every 5th day he's out there, and it's like, oh, quality star, just racking them up. Like he's has been incredibly reliable, as you mentioned, Brandon, since they moved him to a starter in 2023, and he was with the Padres. I would love that. My dream scenario, if we're talking pie in the sky, I would love an Edward Cabrera, a Mackenzie Gore from Washington. I'm again pie in the sky. Or I would love them to. I'm not as high on like Severino
Mm-hmm.
from the Athletics, and I saw a report. It might have been True Blood.
It was.
Someone reported where it was like, hey, the Cubs might go to one team and end up with two players coming back. And if they did that, I wouldn't mind, if we're doing two birds, one stone, maybe hitting up Pittsburgh for like a Mitch Keller and David Bednar. And I know that's going to cost you more, but you're also getting, hey, here's a back end of the bullpen guy, and I love Palencia, but here's another guy to throw into the mix. And then Mitch Keller, who I think is pretty, when I look at like stability, that's a pretty, is he a number two in my eyes? Probably not, but number three, yeah, Mitch Keller can be a good number three starter. And then when I went for realistic options, Seth Lugo was my number one.
Yeah.
So like realistically, and the only reason I would say it maybe it's not realistic. I don't know what Kansas City's doing. Like I don't think they're anywhere near being like a legitimate threat this year come postseason time. Detroit's running away with that division, even though they're like 20-20 in their last 40 games. But Kansas City like just scooped up Adam Frazier, which isn't like sending like a sonic boom throughout the league, but it shows that they're adding instead of, subtracting. They're buying instead of selling. So I don't know what Kansas City's plan is, but you have to imagine they, whoever they would deal Seth Lugo to, if they want to entertain and do business that way, they could get something pretty nice back, I would assume, for him. Because yeah, when I was thinking like realistically, who do I think the Cubs could end up with? Seth Lugo was my number one option. So stole a little bit of my thunder there.
I mean, I think it's an obvious fit for a reason. It's one of those things where, Lugo's got another year on his contract after this year. I think it's only
player option.
I think it
was. I think it is
player option, which means he's very likely to opt out of it in that case. Then, which makes him effectively a rental, which will alter
correct
the trade deadline negotiations. But I think it's really important to bring up. You brought up True Blood's report about the Cubs trying to get those package deals, and I think that's really, really important to note because the Cubs know the way that they're treating this deadline. They're going to try to swing at least one blockbuster trade. And when that happens, you're going to give up multiple top 100 prospects, most likely. So from their perspective, if you're already going to trade Owen Casey or Kevin Alcantara or whoever it may be, whether it's Jackson Wiggins, whoever it may be that they're giving up, if you're going to do that, you might as well try to get more. You might as well try to give up one of those guys in one deal and get more back so that you're not giving up all these really good guys.
A little more bang for your buck, right?
Yeah. And so I think, the Mackenzie Gore rumor really caught my eye. Obviously, that's the dream. I mean, talk about a rotation of southpaw. I mean, when Justin Steele comes back next year, I mean, that's just four unbelievably good lefties at the top of the rotation.
Steele, Shota, Gore, and Boyd. Holy crap.
Obviously, the prospect cost there would be enormous. I mean, he's got, I think, 2.5 or so years left of team control. So, I mean, in that case, obviously, you're talking about you're getting one guy back for many, many top prospects. But regardless of who would, maybe they go after Mason Miller and Severino with the A's, or maybe they, like you said, Bednar and Mitch Keller with the Pirates, or Paul Skeens while we're at it. But that price would be too big. But I think that, it's just the Cubs know that it's nice because it's not like there's like 5 different holes in the lineup that they need to fill. Like the Royals, as an example, the Royals have like 3 above average hitters right now, and then they have holes everywhere else in the lineup. I mean, they just need so many guys that it's for them, they would just need to take like the best player available. The Cubs can target specific needs here where it's third base, it's starting pitching, and it's like another reliever. It doesn't have to be a closer. I think Palencia has really earned that role, but another like late inning reliever. Obviously, Brad Keller's been sort of shaky recently, so getting someone to help, stabilize that part of the bullpen would be nice. But it's so from the Cubs' perspective, if you can knock out 2 of those 3 needs, it's worth giving up an Owen Casey, because then you only got to make one more trade. You only got to go to one more stop to fill out your roster. So I'd like to see something like that. Obviously getting over the fact that we're going to trade some of these really good prospects is just the nature of the business. But I do think that that's the best way the Cubs can do business this trade deadline.
Yeah, it is a player option for Seth Lugo. So you would. It was like 15 million, so imagine he turns that down, even though he's 35, 36, somewhere around there. That would affect his trade value. I feel like it'd be tougher to almost try to negotiate something out then, because you don't know for certain that he would turn it down, but you would imagine he would, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's actually another. The Royals have a really good closer of their own, Carlos Estevez, who they just signed. Maybe that the Royals really need outfielders right now. Maybe you trade for Lugo and Estevez and give up Casey. Again, that's a hypothetical, but it's one of those things where if you're going to give up Casey for Lugo, you might as well try to get more because you don't have multiple Caseys to give up. So
when this deadline, we'll finish on this. I want to say I asked either Trueblood or Jason this a couple of weeks ago. When this deadline comes and goes, and we know, like, it's not, are the Cubs going to make a move? Really, I think the question is, how many moves are they going to make? Mm-hmm. When the deadline comes and goes, and again, this is just, I'm kind of putting you on the spot. Do you think Owen Casey will be in a trade package going somewhere else? I'm not asking you to predict the trade, who, what, but do you think Owen Casey is playing in someone else's system when the trade deadline comes and goes on July 31st?
Had you asked me a month ago, my answer would probably have been no, but he's been on such a ridiculous heater the last 30 days at AAA. It's hard to imagine that the Cubs don't capitalize on that, which I hate because I have been his biggest proponent. I have been banging the drum for him. The last couple of years when Cade Horton and Matt Shaw are coming through the system, I was the guy who was saying Owen Casey's the number one prospect in the system. I don't forget those other guys, but Casey's the best. And I still do firmly believe that. I think he's got a really, really long-term bright future. But given the state of the outfield in Chicago, obviously, hopefully they re-sign Tucker, and if that happens, then Casey really has nowhere to play. But I just think it's one of those things where the best organizations deal from positions of strength. It's what the Dodgers have been doing forever. For the last as they've gone on their huge run over the last 10, 15 years. So the Cubs have a position of strength in the outfield. Casey's their best prospect right now, arguably, and I think it's just knowing that you have to try to win this year. Yeah, I think it's most likely Casey's dealt.
I know I said that was the last point, but I will say, if they deal Owen Casey in a blockbuster trade at the deadline, I will brainwash myself, Brandon, into believing, okay, they did that because they're confident they can re-sign Kyle Tucker in the offseason. Because if this deadline comes and goes and Casey gets dealt and then Tucker signs elsewhere this winter, all of a sudden you're looking at right field. It's like, do we just put Seiya back in there, or I guess you have Alcantara in the minors. There's options, but it's like, man, if Tucker walks this winter, you would imagine you could, just bop Owen Casey right into right field in 2026. Again, we're talking down the road. But if they do make a trade, blockbuster and Owen Casey included, I will convince myself that, they feel pretty confident about re-signing Kyle Tucker. That'll do it for this edition of the Northside Baseball Podcast. Cubs have 2 left with the Royals, and then hit the south side of Chicago for 3 against the White Sox before, in my estimation, Brandon, probably yours as well, the big series everyone looking forward to next Monday through Wednesday in Milwaukee against the Brewers. Brandon, appreciate you hopping on. However you get your podcast, we always appreciate you tuning in, and we'll see you next week.